At 81, Jimmy Page exposes Eddie Van Halen. Jimmy Page, born in 1944 in England, is the legendary guitarist of Led Zeppelin, celebrated for his groundbreaking riffs and innovative production that defined hard rock. Known for songs like Stairway to Heaven, he became an icon of 1970s rock. Eddie Van Halen, born in 1955 in the Netherlands and raised in California, revolutionized guitar, playing with his tapping technique and explosive style. As the co-founder of Van Halen, his solos in songs like Eruption set a new standard in rock music. Together, Page and Van Halen remain eternal symbols of creativity, virtuosity, and influence. Van Halen's revolution, Page's legacy. In the mid-1970s, rock music was forever changed when Eddie Van Halen unveiled his groundbreaking two-handed tapping technique. Unlike traditional playing, Eddie's style turned the guitar into a limitless instrument, producing rapid-fire arpeggios, cascading notes, and sounds no one had heard before. His solo on Eruption became a manifesto of innovation, sparking a revolution that redefined what the electric guitar could be. Eddie didn't just play the instrument, he reinvented it, influencing an entire generation of musicians who saw new creative possibilities in his fearless experimentation. From garage bands to arena stages, his legacy spread like wildfire, cementing him as one of the most important guitarists in history. Yet, while Eddie Van Halen embodied revolution, Jimmy Page represented the mystical foundation of classic rock. As the mastermind guitarist of Led Zeppelin, Page built an unmatched reputation for crafting layered, haunting sounds that blended blues, folk, and psychedelic elements. His riffs in Whole Lotta Love and his epic construction of Stairway to Heaven made him more than a guitarist. He was a sorcerer of sound. Page's playing was at once raw and refined, mysterious, and deeply emotional, transporting listeners into a world where rock music felt both sacred and untouchable. For decades, he has stood as an immortal figure, revered not just as a musician, but as an architect of rock itself. Together, Eddie Van Halen and Jimmy Page embody two different forces of the guitar world: innovation and tradition, revolution and mysticism. Eddie shattered the rules to create something entirely new, while Page stood as a timeless monument of rock's classic roots. Their legacies, though distinct, converge in one truth. The guitar is not just an instrument, but a vessel of imagination, rebellion, and timeless artistry. Jimmy Page and Eddie Van Halen's complex ties. If Jimmy Page stood as the mystical architect of classic rock and Eddie Van Halen the revolutionary of modern guitar, their relationship was inevitably layered with both admiration and rivalry. In the early years, Eddie openly acknowledged the influence of Page on his playing. He studied Led Zeppelin's records intently, absorbing Page's one-handed riff style, his use of space, and his ability to blend raw power with subtle dynamics. Eddie often remarked that Page represented a gateway, proof that guitar could be more than accompaniment. It could be an entire universe of sound. Yet, unlike some of his contemporaries, Eddie never worshipped blindly. He respected Page, but he was determined to carve his own path, refusing to become just another imitator. As Van Halen's career skyrocketed in the late 1970s, Eddie's innovations began to eclipse his influences. The tapping technique, the speed, the sheer audacity of Eruption. Suddenly, he was no longer the student, but the master rewriting the rulebook. It was at this point that their bond became more complex. Page, while recognizing Eddie's brilliance, also represented the towering tradition Eddie had to surpass. For Eddie, admiration slowly intertwined with competition. He saw in Page both an inspiration and a rival, someone to learn from, but also someone to outshine. What made their dynamic fascinating was that it never collapsed into open hostility. There was mutual respect, but also unspoken tension. Page embodied the mysterious, layered artistry of the 1970s, while Eddie carried the torch into the fiery, flashy 1980s. Together, they became like two poles of guitar history, one rooted in the past's depth, the other blazing toward the future. Their relationship was less about friendship and more about legacy. Eddie could never escape Page's shadow, yet he also refused to live within it. In that tension, between reverence and rivalry, the true complexity of their connection is found. Van Halen calls out Jimmy Page. If the bond between Eddie Van Halen and Jimmy Page was already laced with admiration and rivalry, it reached a breaking point in the early 1980s when Eddie delivered one of the most infamous criticisms in rock history. At the height of his fame, Eddie was frequently asked about his influences. And while he acknowledged Page's role as an inspiration, he did not hold back when asked about Zeppelin's live performances. Eddie bluntly described Page's playing as sloppy and inaccurate, a statement that shook the rock community. The tension escalated further in 1981 during a high-profile interview when Eddie went even harsher, quipping that Page played guitar live like someone with a broken hand. The words landed like a thunderbolt. For fans who revered Page as a near-mythic figure, Eddie's critique felt almost sacrilegious, a young guitar hero openly mocking the master who had paved the way. It sparked heated debates, dividing audiences between loyal Zeppelin devotees and the new generation rallying around Van Halen's explosive virtuosity. For many, the remark symbolized more than a personal jab. It became a cultural clash between eras. Page embodied the raw, mystical energy of the 1970s, with performances that prioritized atmosphere and experimentation over precision. Eddie, by contrast, was the face of a new era where technical mastery, speed, and clarity defined greatness. His criticism was not only of Page's style, but of an older philosophy of rock itself. The fallout was immense. Some saw Eddie as arrogant, disrespectful to a legend. Others admired his candor, viewing it as proof that he was confident enough to step out of Page's shadow. Either way, the statement cemented the sense of a generational duel. Page as the god of classic rock, Eddie as the revolutionary who refused to bow. In that clash, rock history witnessed not just a feud, but the passing of a torch, explosive, controversial, and unforgettable. Clash of eras, Jimmy Page and Eddie Van Halen. If Eddie Van Halen's criticism of Jimmy Page exposed a generational divide, the deeper truth lay in their starkly different philosophies of music. Jimmy Page, as the mastermind of Led Zeppelin, built his reputation not on sheer technicality, but on atmosphere, mystery, and emotional depth. His guitar work was like a spell, layered, hypnotic, and designed to transport listeners into another realm, whether it was the haunting chords of Kashmir or the ethereal build of Stairway to Heaven. Page treated music as an immersive journey, where every riff carried weight beyond the notes themselves. He transformed rock into something mystical, a soundscape that was equal parts blues, folk, and psychedelia. Eddie Van Halen, by contrast, came to embody the sheer physicality and energy of rock's new era. His signature style revolved around speed, precision, and technical innovation, with the two-handed tapping technique becoming his trademark. Watching Eddie play was not only about hearing notes, it was about witnessing a dazzling performance that combined athleticism with artistry. Songs like Eruption, weren't just compositions. They were feats of endurance, explosions of energy that pushed the limits of what guitar could do. Where Page drew listeners inward into mystery, Eddie blasted them outward with shock and awe. This contrast shaped how fans perceived them: Page as the shaman, Eddie as the warrior. For some, Page's music felt like poetry, weaving moods and colors into an otherworldly tapestry. For others, Eddie represented the liberation of rock, an adrenaline rush that electrified stadiums and redefined what it meant to be a guitar hero. Neither approach was better. Instead, they stood as two opposing philosophies of rock guitar. Page showed that music could be an art of subtle power and emotional resonance, while Eddie proved it could also be a spectacle of innovation and raw energy. In the end, their divergence enriched the world of rock. Page and Eddie may have stood on different sides of the spectrum, but together, they demonstrated the boundless possibilities of the guitar. Their contrast was not a weakness, it was a dialogue, one that continues to inspire generations of musicians searching for their own balance between mystery and mastery. Eddie's words, Jimmy Page's silence. If the clash of styles between Jimmy Page and Eddie Van Halen defined an era, then what followed was just as revealing: Page's silence. When Eddie's biting criticisms echoed through the rock world in the early 1980s, mocking Page's live playing as sloppy and even comparing him to a man with a broken hand, many expected an equally sharp rebuttal from the Led Zeppelin guitarist. But none came. Page, the very figure Eddie had challenged, chose instead to remain quiet. For years, Page never directly addressed Eddie's comments, leaving fans and journalists puzzled. Was it pride, restraint, or indifference? To some, his silence signaled dignity, an unwillingness to be dragged into a public feud with a younger musician. After all, by the early 1980s, Led Zeppelin had disbanded following John Bonham's death, and Page himself was navigating grief, personal struggles, and the weight of living as a rock legend. Responding to Eddie's provocations might have seemed beneath him, or perhaps simply irrelevant to the larger story of his career. To others, though, the silence carried a different tone, one of distance, even detachment. Page's refusal to answer gave room for speculation, with critics and fans filling the void. Some wondered if he was hurt by the words but unwilling to show it, while others believed he saw Eddie as part of a different generation entirely, not worth engaging in a war of words. Whatever the case, the absence of a response only fueled the sense of rivalry, making the story larger than it might have been if Page had simply spoken once. The silence also fit neatly with Page's persona. Throughout his career, he had cultivated an aura of mystery, preferring to let his music, not his voice, define him. Unlike Eddie, outspoken, exuberant, and unafraid of controversy, Page seemed to exist on another plane, where words mattered less than soundscapes. By refusing to comment, he reinforced the image of the enigmatic sorcerer of rock, untouched by the noise of disputes. His silence became its own kind of statement, that his legacy required no defense. Decades later, this quietness remains striking. In an age when feuds and rivalries often play out in public, Page's decision to stay above the fray feels almost radical. It allowed Eddie's words to live on in memory, but it also kept Page's dignity intact. Rather than battling for dominance, he seemed to suggest that time itself would decide whose influence endured. And in a way, both legacies survived. Eddie went on to become the icon of innovation, while Page remained the eternal mystic of rock. But it is Page's silence that still lingers. an unanswered pause in the dialogue of guitar history. For fans, that quietness can feel frustrating, mysterious, or even wise. For Page, it may simply have been the most powerful answer of all. Jimmy Page's final words on Eddie. If Jimmy Page's silence defined his stance during Eddie Van Halen's most controversial criticisms, then his words after Eddie's death in 2020 revealed something profoundly different: admiration, respect, and reconciliation. For decades, Page had refrained from answering Eddie's jabs, allowing speculation to swirl. But when news broke of Eddie's passing on October 6, 2020, the world of rock paused, and so did Page. For the first time, he spoke directly about Eddie, calling him the real deal. In those three simple words, Page erased years of tension, acknowledging Eddie not as a rival, but as a true artist whose contributions were undeniable. Page went further, admitting what many already knew. Eddie Van Halen had changed the guitar forever. With his two-handed tapping, speed, and fearless experimentation, Eddie reinvented the instrument, pushing it into territories no one had imagined before. For Page, who had once been accused by Eddie of sloppy playing, the tribute carried weight. It was not defensive, not dismissive, but celebratory. Page made it clear that Eddie's innovations had elevated the craft of rock guitar itself. The tribute resonated because it was both an act of healing and a final gesture of respect. Page's acknowledgement symbolized the closing of a generational rift. It suggested that rivalry, criticism, and silence had all been overshadowed by the lasting truth of Eddie's genius. For fans, it felt like the two guitar gods were finally united, even if only through memory and words spoken too late. In a way, Page's tribute also reflected his philosophy, that legacies are decided not in arguments but in time. By waiting, he allowed the dust of conflict to settle, so that his words would carry sincerity rather than defensiveness. His final salute was understated yet powerful, placing Eddie among the pantheon of musicians who didn't just play the guitar, they redefined it. For Page, Eddie was not simply an innovator, but a spirit who embodied the restless search for new sounds. And in acknowledging that, Page honored not only Eddie's artistry, but also the very spirit of rock and roll itself. It was a farewell without bitterness, an homage that felt less like closure and more like a bridge, linking the mystic of the past with the revolutionary of the future. Two legacies, opposite yet complementary. If Jimmy Page's silence and final tribute defined his character, then what remains most striking is how his legacy stands in contrast and in harmony with Eddie Van Halen's. Page was the artisan of mystery, weaving layers of sound that invited listeners into a world of depth and atmosphere. His guitar spoke in whispers and storms, conjuring moods that felt timeless and enigmatic. Each riff was less about dazzling precision and more about evoking a sense of wonder. A reminder that music could be a spiritual journey as much as a performance. Eddie Van Halen, by contrast, embodied the electricity of speed, innovation, and spectacle. He shattered expectations of what the guitar could do, not through mysticism, but through sheer technical brilliance and physical energy. His solos were not veils of mystery, but eruptions of adrenaline, bursts of fire that electrified audiences and set new standards for virtuosity. Where Page drew listeners inward into a maze of moods, Eddie blasted them outward in a rush of pure excitement. On the surface, their legacies seem opposed, one contemplative, the other explosive, one mystical, the other visceral. Yet together, they prove a deeper truth. that greatness in music is not bound to a single path. Page demonstrated the power of atmosphere and depth, while Eddie redefined the limits of speed and innovation. Their contributions did not cancel each other out, but instead expanded the possibilities of what the guitar and rock music itself could become. Fans and historians now look back and see not a rivalry, but a dialogue. Page and Eddie spoke different musical languages, yet both enriched the dictionary of rock. They stand today as proof that artistry can wear many faces, and that the guitar's voice is infinite, capable of being both a spell and a firestorm. In that sense, their legacies, though opposite, were never in conflict. They were complementary chapters in the same story, the ongoing evolution of rock's most powerful instrument. From rivalry to reverence, from admiration to rivalry, and finally to respect. The story of Jimmy Page and Eddie Van Halen is more than a tale of two guitarists. It is the chronicle of rock guitar's evolution. Page, with his mystical atmospheres and layered depth, built the foundations of classic rock's grandeur. Eddie, with his blazing technique and fearless innovation, reimagined the instrument for a new generation. Their journey was not just personal, but symbolic, marking the transition between eras and philosophies of music. What began as influence turned into competition, and ultimately matured into mutual recognition. Today, their legacies stand not in opposition, but in harmony, reminding us that greatness wears many forms. Together, Page and Van Halen continue to inspire countless musicians, proving that the guitar's story is never finished, but always evolving. Just as Eddie Van Halen and Jimmy Page left their eternal mark on music history, we invite you to join our journey. Like, comment, and subscribe today.